So I am joined today by Jed, and Jason has joined us for the second installment in our series on Sergei Bulgakov's Apocalypse of John, a Dogmatic Interpretation. This time we are dealing with chapter 2, which deals with chapters 2 and 3 of the text of Revelation, which is the letters to the seven churches. I intend to supplement Bulgakov here a bit today with some of the things that Emil Bach brings up in his treatment of the Apocalypse of John, because this is an area where I think Bulgakov kind of left a lot of meat on the bone. And Bach made some observations that I think Bulgakov probably should have made. So I'll probably be bringing in some stuff from Bach's text in our discussion today.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that, because I was going to bring in, this is probably, I feel like this chapter is probably illustrates better Bulgakov's method than it does like the actual findings, because he's very tentative to make like any like final exegetical determinations, like in terms of what the text was meaning in its own context. And so that's really not his area of study to begin with. But so, I mean, I'm going to be pulling in this little title here, this Richard Bauckham title as well, just to supplement, because I think as we deal with the letters to the churches, I agree with you that, in this chapter, you're not getting like the full sense of what, the full scope or vision of what Bulgakov's trying to accomplish in the book, but there are some helpful things in terms of method.
Right. Well, I think there's some kind of ground in between the kind of like speculative, like historical interpretation that Bulgakov, I think correctly is warning against, versus a symbolic interpretation, which I think he still leaves symbolically. I think he leaves some things there. Like he doesn't even for example, like Bach like opens his section on the letters. He actually begins with talking about the symbolic significance of 7 to begin with. Like, so why is it 7 letters to the churches? Is the first question that Bach addressed. And he relates the symbolism of 7 to be connected to time. And this is fairly intuitively obvious because of the 7 days of the week. So, and specifically, it represents time in a kind of a cyclical mode. So, which kind of shows you that these churches, or these letters to the churches, are not just for their time, but are for all times.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's an interesting thing, because I was kind of there's so many other areas within Bulgakov's work where he is really unpacking and dealing with the symbolic imagery. And I think that's, it's a fair criticism of this chapter. I don't think it's indicative of the whole book, but it's one of the shortest chapters of the book.
Yeah.
But the appearance of the 7s in Revelation is kind of important, right? So you have
and this is our first, and this is the first of our 7s, which is why Bach goes straight there. It's like, okay, we have these repeated patterns of 7, which then unfold into repeated patterns of 12. What is the basic symbolic meaning of these repeated patterns of 7? What is the basic symbolic meaning of these repeating patterns of 12? And I actually shared this with this is kind of, it was in my mind because it came up in my conversation with Martin Shaw when we were talking about Parsifal. And actually, believe it or not, Emil Bach, actually, the very first paragraph of his chapter on these letters, he makes reference to Wagner's opera, Parsifal. So he says, when Parsifal in Wagner's opera sets foot for the first time upon the territory of the Grail, he becomes aware that his pace alters. A strange, new, unsuspected relationship to time and space occurs to him. Astonished, he says, I have hardly taken a step, yet I feel I have gone far. And his age guide Gernemans explains, You see, my son, here time becomes space. In its whole construction, the apocalypse is Grail country, where for those who traverse it and who pass all the tests, time becomes space. It appears in the different laws of number by which it is governed at the beginning and at the end. It advances from the 7 to the 12. For us today, numbers normally express only quantities, but books like Revelation of St. John still reckon throughout with the qualitative character of numbers. So that's like his very opening observation is like, it's 7 for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, if you look at, and I think I want you to correct me if I'm wrong here, Nate, or Jason too. Like in my counting, I think we're looking at like 7 cycles of 7 in the book of Revelation, right? So you have 7 lampstands, 7 stars, right? And the angels that are associated with them.
7 angels.
You have the churches,
vials, the trumpets,
the eyes of the lamb, and then the bowls, right? You're looking at this like repetition of at least 7 cycles of 7. There may be more. You could make an argument that there's 8 or more, right? It depends on how you want to split them up. But I guess my question, and I was hoping you would unpack that because I think it's a really important point, is so what do you think, if I know you've already alluded to like kind of the cyclical nature of time, but like, do you think like in a sense, all of the septets within the book are in some sense relating to some kind of that kind of fullness and possibly the time and the cyclical element of time?
Well, I think for Bach and I think for me, it's not merely cyclical, right? But this will be a difference between the Christian vision of the eschaton versus like say older, more traditional pre-Christian eschatologies where everything really is just an endlessly repeating cycle. But for Christianity, yes, there are cycles, but the cycles are more like a spiral, right? So there's also a progress. There's an evolution in these cycles. So there are cycles, but there's also evolution at the same time.
Yeah,
and movement towards something. So Bach specifically, what he says is that what you see in these cycles of 7 is that actually as you go through the different cycles of 7, so he points out in his chapter on the letters that the letters are all about the same length, right? At first, like all the messages are about the same length, but then as you start going through the additional cycles of 7, then you see like, so for the seals, like I think it's the first 3 seals are about the same length, but then the 4th seal goes on for significantly longer. And then the last seal kind of just folds directly into the first trumpet. Like there almost is no interval in between. So he actually sees it as an expression of the kairotic nature of time as you advance toward apocalypse. So it's not really about, the increased length doesn't mean increased duration. It's indicating an increased eventfulness.
Like an increase in, not necessarily an increase in quantity, but an increase in magnitude.
Which is why exactly what he starts off saying, this is not about number in the quantitative mode. That's not what we're dealing with here. These are symbolic numbers, and symbolic numbers are always about the qualitative mode of number.
Yeah. Well, and I think like, I mean, it kind of piggybacks off of one of our previous conversations, and Jason, you were in on this one as we were kind of exploring, some of the spiral dynamic, right? Is I do think that like what the book is doing is it's placing you like in one of Yeats's gyres, right? You have a cycle, right? And you're completing it, and you can't see this on the screen, but like you're coming further and further in, but at each point in the spiral, you kind of have that circular rhyme, right? So each cycle has its kind of this rhythmic element where you can see the repetition, but it's not pure repetition. It has an amplitude and a force. Like it's almost like it's a vectored kind of dynamic that the book is really driving within the kind of a spiral structure really throughout the book, even though that structure is not very discernible from, when you're reading it in that linear fashion, you're kind of missing the dimension of the book if you're just reading the linear text.
One of the things that Bulgakov does pick up on, that Bach reiterates and spends a little bit more time with, is that Bulgakov does make the observation that these would be actually a circuit. Mm-hmm. These 7 churches would represent a circuit for John as a presbyter to these churches. So it represents like the order in which he would make his circuit amongst these churches. And then Bach actually develops that like even further, and he actually goes into like analyzing the actual geography of the area of the 7 churches, and he kind of ties it to our cyclical evolution, like as human beings, both in our individual lives. Like, so for him, Ephesus, which this is the reason for Bach, the reason that it's the first love, that Ephesus is indicated as having loss. He thinks it has to do with Ephesus being closely associated to like the heart of the brighter, closer to the heavens, less further advanced from the fall, connected to the earth. So let me actually here, I'll just read for you what he says. It's on page 35 of the Apocalypse of John. He says, we cannot attain to the last love, to the earthly goals, so long as we belong to those who have forsaken the first love. Such an apocalyptic formula as that of the first love should not be taken too humanly. The first love is the love which animates children. The spirit and soul of a human being would not descend to earth at birth if they were not led to do so by love of the earth. Only afterwards we forget why we came down into incarnation. But the joyous surrender of a child to all that is earthly is the echo of the prenatal love for the earth. Love for the earth is the meaning of the apocalyptic expression, the first love. It lies hidden in the depths of our own being. In the course of life, we fall into too easily the temptation to look back longingly to heaven, and hence to be disloyal to the earth. The cultivation of this first love forms the first step in the path to Philadelphia. Nor must our religious life cause us to forget the first love and egoistic yearning for the world beyond. This is the error with which the Church of Ephesus is reproached. The last love is spoken of in the conclusion of the 7 messages. He who has opened the door when Christ knocks and is in communion with him, who enters, may be enthroned with him. And as Christ sits at the right hand of the Father to carry out the deeds of the Father, so may he sit at the right hand of Christ and share in the fullness of his creative and transforming power. The last love is the guiding love of God to men, but man cannot participate. By it, man cannot participate in the goal of evolution. So that's when Ephesus is reprimanded for losing their first love, it's the connection to the earth that they're being chided for losing. So, and he goes into this a lot more, even in just looking at the geography of the regions that are being described. But I would refer people back to, I think we get into that the geographical portion of that a bit in our conversations that we had on Apocalypse of John by Emil Bach back when we did that. But Bulgakov's answer to that is really flat, I think, in this chapter.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, I'm with you on that. I have some things I want to build off of there, but I don't want to keep Jason from jumping in here. So did you have any thoughts or impressions so far, Jason?
I'm just no corrections. I'm just listening mostly and a little hesitant to unmute myself because of the mower and everything. But
Gotcha.
there's I actually, when I was reading Bulgakov's book, the chapter today, for some reason that thought came to my mind as well. The first love being the love for the earth. Like first comes the natural, then comes the spiritual, and kind of almost this rebuke against Gnosticism or something. But I had never, even that had never occurred to me before reading Revelation. So that was kind of interesting that, I don't know why that never came to mind before, but it makes sense. But then it made me think of, the first commandment, love the Lord God with all your heart, soul. And then the second commandment, it's like it, which is love the people of the earth too, sort of love your neighbor as yourself. So I wasn't sure how to tie those in exactly, but yeah, sorry, I don't really have much of a comment other than,
can you love God without love? But here's the thing though, even if to go back, you don't even need to jump ahead to the second part of that. You can go back to the first part of that. To love God, how can you love God if you do not love his works?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's implicit in the love of God would have to be an appreciation of God's works.
Yeah. And the first commandment is what to tend to the garden, basically. Well,
right.
Be fruitful and multiply. Yeah.
Right. And they're also it's actually quite consistent with what's actually said in the text too, because and I think I have David Bentley Hart's translation here because that's the one that was handy. But if we actually look at the text of the letter to Ephesus here, let's see, here we go. Okay, so write to the angel of the assembly in Ephesus, the one who wields the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks amid the 7 lampstands, says this: I know your works and your labor and endurance, that you cannot bear evil men, have tested those who claim to be apostles and are no such thing, and have found them to be false. And you have endurance, and have borne up because of my name, and have not grown weary. But I hold it against you that you abandoned your first love. Therefore, remember from where you have fallen. That's that kind of Edenic kind of connection that I was talking about, that Bach brings out, and which is where the true love of the earth is rooted, right? And that love for creation as God has intended it in his act of creation. And change your heart and practice the works you practiced at first. And if not, I am coming to you and remove your lampstand from its place, etc. And you can see this. What the things that you're getting right they're very intellectual things, right? So it's like, okay, so you're getting all these things correct in terms of like doctrine, and you're opposing people who are teaching things that I also find abhorrent, and you are, you have spiritual endurance, and you're bearing up under persecution. But hey, what about this? Right? What about this just deep and abiding connection to the creation that I have given you to inhabit?
Yeah. Well, I know that, I mean, we're already, as per usual in our Grail Country discussions, pretty far afield from the text. So I'm just going to venture a little further.
But we're actually in the text, though.
I know. I know. That's the funny thing about it, right? So, a couple of things that I would add to that, right? So like Bach's journey through the 7 cities in Asia Minor is, so in some of the yogic traditions, the journey through the chakras is also represented by certain journeys up and down the Ganges River, right? So it's an interesting it's an interesting connection, but the connection I want to make isn't necessarily directly attached to that. But like Bauckham makes the same point in his little New Testament theology on the Book of Revelations, that this is a cyclical letter that has probably, even at its writing, was meant to have a broader significance beyond the communities that are comprised of the 7 churches, right? And because the invitation in Bulgakov goes in there as well, is, you know, the formulary of, you know, hear what the Spirit has to say to the churches, essentially, right? So, you know, undoing Isaiah's kind of indictment of hearing they do not hear, seeing they do not see, is the invitation. This is Christian prophecy as well, right? So the letters there, it's epistolary, but it's a Christian prophecy that is wrapped within the overall structure of the apocalypse, right? Is that the invitation to hear? So it's a very different, it's a modification off of like the traditional prophetic formula of "thus saith the Lord," right? So the shift goes into from what God is saying, right? That we see that formula, that prophetic formula that's so dominant in the Hebrew scriptures. There's an inversion where the message is not discounting what the Lord is saying or what the Spirit is saying, but is putting the onus upon the hearer, right? The one whose ears have been opened. To him who has ears to hear, let him hear, right? And if you go back into the kind of this 7-fold structure and kind of building again off of the book of Isaiah, which I think is something that John is doing, is definitely within the overall, I would say, cultural milieu in which he's writing, is that it's an echo of some of the concepts of like the 7 heavens that are spoken of in Isaiah chapter 11, or the tradition that arises out of chapter 11, and the lowest and the primary, or the foundational heaven, not the highest heaven, which would be reflected in the divine wisdom. The lowest heaven is the one, it speaks to that earthly reality, right? Is it's described as the fear of the Lord which fills the whole earth, right? And speaking of reverence or wonder, that we have been given this space in which to experience the divine life, and that is expressed in that kind of, it's not necessarily expressed in like the terror or the terrorized form of fear, but in the reverential and the wonder that fear is meant to evoke within us. And so that love for the earth that you're talking about, I think there is a legitimate connection there into the letter to the Ephesians. Is it's not talking about necessarily, it's not necessarily primarily an ecological statement, although I would include that, include ecology within that, but it speaks to a kind of a proper ordering.
Well, for
right?
Bach,
a proper ordering of creaturely relations that are subsumed within an overall, like, if you forget that principle, that this all belongs, this is God's domain, and this is the product of his creative activity, and that your love is rooted in that primary fact, right? And that love, that first love is echoed in the final love, which is echoed in the divine wisdom itself, and that gets picked up again in the last of the 7 epistles. Is, I think that there's a movement within these epistles that it's, in a sense, it is taking you on that same circuit or that same journey that John would be taking, or a messenger who's delivering letters would be taking. He's delivering the entire book probably to these 7 different churches. In what way, that's, who knows, but I think it's an important point. And I do think that, like Bulgakov makes that point, in the text and in this chapter, is that the primary focus is on the one who hears.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting, and this is where I guess I have a question, I would really love to hear what you guys have to expand on this, is that the church, the letters are addressed to the angels.
Yep. I almost interrupted you to ask you about that.
Yeah. So I want to see what you guys come up with and what you're able to play with in that.
Yeah. So first of all, that's actually something that Bach and Bulgakov are in agreement on. Like, and Bulgakov and Bach both entertained the idea that like literally the term could have been used to mean the presbyters, but that's not really well established until the 2nd century, and it seems that it more likely actually means angels. Is where they both land on that. And then just really quickly on the letter to Ephesus, I definitely don't want it to sound like I'm talking about some sort of like just like knee-jerk environmentalism and this idea of the love of the earth. And in fact, what Bach ties it to actually is childhood, to just like that like open-hearted embrace of the creation. So it's not like it's not a save the earth thing. It's just like calling you to remember your intuitive love of the earth and its beauty that you have as a gift of nature. Like that's a given that we fall out of. And that's actually one of the things that's going on in these letters, is actually we're seeing how we kind of recede away from these things that are given to us naturally, and we can only maintain them by holding fast, which is what these are, some of what's going on with these reminders. And Bach also makes the same point that you just made, Jed, that it's important that it begins and ends with a reminder about love. And he also connects, even in the section that I read, he connects the first love to the last love. Like it's necessary. There's a necessary connection between those things. In order to get to the one, you have to hold fast to the first.
Yeah.
And some of these other principles, and Bach kind of sees these, much as Tomberg does, much as Tomberg sees the entire book of Revelation as a whole, as a series of spiritual exercises. That is actually what Bach is suggesting is contained within these addresses to the angels of the 7 churches, is that they're little mini spiritual exercises. That so they're actually, yes, they're to these 7 historical churches, but there's also they're also a circuit, and symbolically they represent cycles and repeated patterns, but at the same time they're also addressed directly to you, because our lives, part of what's going on, especially from Bach's point of view, as he connects it to cycles and to time and to evolution, he reflects on several occasions about how our own life development patterns reflect this same sort of cycle, as it's what's being talked about in these addresses to the churches. So
yeah, and I think it's, I like where you're taking that, because I do think that Bulgakov's point is more of a dogmatic reading, right?
Yeah,
and so he's wants to derive like important theological insights, which actually I think is a good way to read the book, right? Because it is difficult to get into. We don't have a great understanding of the historical the historical situation in those 7 churches, and I think that Bulgakov is kind of writing aware of his own limitations of not being able to penetrate much into the history itself. And so the wisdom in reading a text theologically and allowing the rich symbolism to inflect and inform a theological reading of the text. But kind of circling back to the question that I had raised, as far as, because and Jason, I'm not sure how, I know you are just starting the book, so you're probably jumping in at, it's an interesting point, because I do think that the Bulgakov, the weakness of this chapter is how much meat he leaves on the bone, just like Nate said, but the strength of it is how much meat he leaves on the bone. He's definitely going to whittle away at that throughout the book. But is his insistence, and there's a certain reticence that I appreciate in a tentativeness in Bulgakov's approach of not trying to overstate the case of what the symbols literally mean, and not trying to overstate the case of kind of a literal reading of the text. I think that's a really good way to approach Revelation, because I think if you push those symbols into literal antecedents, you're getting into all kinds of just thorny problems. But back to the angels, right? This is something that thematically is going to really show up a lot in Bulgakov's later statements within the book. Is there is a deep affinity and connection between the angelic and the human world, and so he makes an allusion to it, and he says possibly it's he alludes to it even in his own work in Jacob's Ladder, which is really regarding the angels. So I'm just curious, as far as like, as you guys kind of, I'm sure we've read Revelation enough to have some familiarity with the text, is like, if you were to take a stab at that human angelic connection, like, because both are the audience, right? The human audience and the angelic audience are one and the same, maybe have different functions, but they're both equally being addressed here. Like, what do you think John's trying to drive at there?
Well, it seems to me he's talking to, I thought that part was actually really fascinating as well, that he made note of that. I think that was at the beginning of the chapter too, but it seems like he's talking directly to the principality, is what I would think. And the way Peugeot talks about it sometime, like the angel of, what is it, France or something? You could destroy the city, but you can't destroy the angel, or something like that. And so it's the same here. I like that he draws that out, because it's just, like, even the historical cities are gone, like you're saying, there's still this message that remains, because it's not to the specific place, it's to the angel, it's to the principality and power. It's this, I guess, I don't know if you could say animating spirit. I'm not sure what I would normally take that to mean. I guess you could maybe say that. And then he goes into like, after he addressed the angel, he'll go into the characteristics of the city that the angel is hovering over, I guess, containing. I don't know. That's my takeaway from it. I don't know if that's
okay. Yeah.
But
well, yeah. So yeah, I noticed the footnote to Jacob's Ladder, which I read recently, as well. I'm not sure. Like, I agree with a lot of what Bulgakov's thought on angels in Jacob's Ladder. But here's where I would actually probably differ. Well, I'm not sure I differ with Peugeot, because Peugeot's vague on this. I actually think that the angels, that angels of locations, are actually not tied to the people groups. They're tied to the land. Now, with churches, that would be different, I would say, because churches are, churches are not, churches are only, they're only configurations of collective configurations of people. Like, I don't, there's no like, once the structure is gone, it's like, I don't know, what is, are the, I guess the question I would ask is the angel, are the angels of the church of Ephesus or Smyrna or Pergamon or any of these churches, are they still active? Have those angels been reassigned to other duties? What is the how did, like, to me, like, and this, I'm thinking about this from as a kind of person who is like thinking about in terms of general mythology, and not necessarily limiting myself to thinking about this in terms of Christian theology, but like spirits are generally like very place associated. And there, it's hard, and belief in angels and demons is a very kind of, it's a very ecumenical ground, right? Like, even to the point of like being like cross traditional. because it's universal. You can't find any like human spiritual tradition that doesn't have some kind of belief of good spirits and evil spirits. But generally, like those things are tied most closely to places.
I would take a little bit of a different, I don't know if it contradicts what you're saying, Nate, so much as like I would.
No, I'm actually just trying to figure out. I'm actually not even.
I'm looking, I think just even in the sense of, I think that because, I mean, you're talking about the delivery of a message, I think that this has more to do with the deputizing of a messenger, which could be divine or what we would typically call angelic.
Right. Well, that's what
right.
The literal meaning is messenger.
Right. And so I don't like my own sense of probably, although there aren't any named archangels outside of Michael in the book of Revelation, I think my personal leaning, and I'm not conclusive on this, but my personal leaning is that this, because I would take the 7 churches in the book to be archetypal of the universal church.
Mm-hmm.
I would also probably be more inclined to view kind of an archangelic type role that these messages are being mediated through, mm-hmm. as a paradigmatic whole to the whole, like a sevenfold message to the whole church. Right. And I think the reason why I would say that
even if I limit myself to Christian mythology, right? Even if I limit myself to Christian mythology, there's still a definite association, even if it's not a one-to-one correspondence, there's a definite association to the power of an angel and how big the location that angel is associated with. So the reason why Satan is the prince of this world is that before he is fallen, he's the angel of the earth. C.S. Lewis picks up on this in his space trilogy, right? So it's like, this is pretty well established, like Christian mythology. So even in Christian mythology, there is definitely a strong association between angel and place.
Right.
And it's not just the people. It's not just the people. It's actually to place as well as to people.
And I think that the broader, like your broader point is, I think, valid, irrespective of whether or not these angelic mediators of this message that's being delivered, whether or not they're specifically tied to that territory in some sort of permanent, like they're, like a territorial kind of angelic presence. I don't know. I haven't put much thought into it other than this discussion right here, as far as, how tied to the territory are they? I would incline to see the formula lends itself to me to kind of this deputizing role, to deliver the message, to a particular congregation for the whole church.
Right.
And, but I guess like the more interesting question for me is, because
there are 7 of them, right? And the 7 is also the number that represents the fullness of the Holy Spirit, because the 7 spirits of God. So I think it is something different. Like these are special angels, I think.
Yeah. I guess that was kind of what I'm driving at, is like I wouldn't put them in that same category or class as like a principality over like a territorial.
I think exactly right. So I think these are special angels, and I think that's because the church is what is building toward the kingdom, right? Which isn't tied to, the kingdom isn't tied to place, right? It's every place and no place.
Yeah.
So the angels of these churches can't be tied to those historical landforms that are being addressed in the same way. So they actually have to represent the whole church everywhere and through all time. And they have to just be different aspects of this. The 7 of which combined represent the fullness of the Holy Spirit, which is the ultimate, which is going to lead toward the manifestation of the kingdom.
Right. And this is where I would say, like, I do, Bulgakov seems content to say that John is writing like on this occasional, and it just so happens that he had written to 7 churches. But I think that like the structure of 7's within the overall work. I think that there's a wholeness that he's pointing to, a Catholicity almost that John is like, that he's signifying with the 7's. One of the interesting features, and I always found that the wordplay in the letters, it's really interesting in Greek, right? So especially like one of the common themes, right? Because there's constantly this promise to him who overcomes. But there's a wordplay in several of the epistles within the letters to the 7 churches, that there's a false and a true manifestation of overcoming. Same word group. It's the word where we get Nike from, right? Or the Nicolaitans, right? It has to do with victory or overcoming or conquering. There's a false mode of conquering, the so-called Nicolaitans, which, from what most people would say, some sort of proto-Gnostic kind of influence. Some have said that one of the guys that may be at the target of that is Cerinthus, based on John Baird gets into that in some of his work on John the Theologian, his book on the Book of John. But he does end up referencing some of this. Is that there's some sort of Gnostic background in there, but the false overcomers are contrasted with this call to overcome and these really lofty statements, like that you will be a fixture in the temple, that you'll be given basically a Davidic designation. Basically, you're given a messianic designation in the coming kingdom, and like these really lofty things, right? And so, but there's this counterfeit overcoming that is also present within the work, but it's like, often tied to like the false teaching, right? And the things that, Jesus is speaking of that he finds intolerable within the churches is almost a sense that, you get this active voice, like he's going to make war with them, or, he's going to come after them with the sword of his mouth and those kinds of things. Obviously the image itself is violent, but I think that the warning is speaking of something that is more animated by a love and a concern. Is like in every one of these promises to overcome there's this really lofty statement of whether it's a name, white stone, that your name is written on that nobody else knows but you and God, kind of thing, like all these kind of really cool things. Is that falling into those false teachings actually robs us of our actual inheritance of what is promised when we actually overcome. And so I think the stark warning there is kind of like there's a paternal side of this that Jesus is speaking, a paternal voice that he's speaking in, is to, in each of the different epistles, the church is being called to overcome in some way. Sometimes overcome in a way where, stay the course, like Philadelphia would be an example of a church that is in pretty good shape, stay the course, but you're going to hit some serious turbulence while you're moving through, or churches that are realistically having to overcome real flaws and defects in whether it's their teaching or whether it's their practice. And so I think that wordplay, I think, is it's interesting. And what's interesting to me as it connects to Bulgakov is that overall, one of the themes that will surface again and again in the book is just his overall sophiology, which is an invitation into the participation of this divine life and of theosis itself, right? Is that I think the aim of Revelation is to pull us into that world where, into the New Jerusalem, into that New Jerusalem reality, is one of full participation. And so, I know that might connect to some of our prior conversations on the evolution of consciousness and the idea of, we're in withdrawn participation now, but final participation awaits us. And in order to get to that place, there is a kind of overcoming that the Christian community is called to, with these various challenges that the church faced, and maybe in those particular situations, but they're, I think, very applicable to just a general sense of what the church has always been fighting to overcome.
Right. Yeah. So just on the note of the false overcoming, what do we want to make of Bulgakov doesn't really say much, but what do we want to make of the line in the address to the church at Pergamos, with the reference to the seed of Satan? Jed, did we lose you?
Would that be the seed of pride, or is that would be my?
You think it's the seed of pride?
Well, that's I feel like I've heard that term before. That's usually the idea of what the sin of Satan is the sin
Right.
of pride, like referencing Timothy.
But why does he tie it to this particular? Why does he tie it to this particular church? Like, why is it? Why is there a link to the church at Pergamos and this where Satan dwelleth?
I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I apologize. I had to step away. I'm cranking coffee here.
Yeah, what I was just kind of like wanting to play what you were talking about with this false overcoming, with why you think it's in the letter to the church at Pergamos where you have the reference to Satan's seat. Like, do you think that's just like, is that some kind of like, you know, I mean, Bulgakov talks about it a bit, you know, like whether it's some kind of like archaeological fact that's been lost that's being pointed at, or Jason has suggested it's like a spiritual principle that's being hinted at, in which case my answer would be like, why that particular church then? Why is that the place where it's raised? What in the rest of the address to the church would give us reason to think that's a particular concern in that church to be addressed there? What do you think? I have an idea.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have brought it up.
Yeah. I guess like I want to back up with that into like a side point, and then before unpacking is you get the kind of these dual references to the synagogue of Satan. Bulgakov talks about that as well, and you know, those who call themselves Jews but are not. Like, I think this is where like the work of Paula Fredrickson, you know, the Jewish New Testament scholar, is really fantastic, because I think what we forget with the passage of history is we're reading these as Christian texts, but these were probably not self-consciously Christian in the same way, right? You have that kind of the intra-Judaic debate, essentially, right? Which, you know, not uncommon for one Jew to call another Jew the son of Belial, or the son of Satan, and you know, you could say they may be engaging in hyperbole or not. But I think that there is there's an ongoing debate within the letters based on like calling into question like who is the rightful heir to David's seat, to David's throne. And so I see very much a Jewish debate going on within the text. And I just wanted to point that out because I think it's very easy for us to read that in an anti-Semitic sort of way, when I think you have an differing views on the correct way to approach Judaism, right, in this early text. I don't think that you're looking at something that would be Christian, like a Christian understanding and identity that would be identical to what you'd see in like the 4th century or the 6th century or later, where there's a real emerging sense of the Christianity as a religion, right? But the seed of Satan, I think the comment that I want to make on that, because I think it's a good question. I know you probably have a direction you want to go with that, but I think that thematically within the book is, Satan is present within at least in a location sense, like that Satan is something that someone that the church must contend with. He's in their midst, right, in Pergamum. But in the midst of the whole drama that's unfolding within, all the chapters that follow, is you have this sense of like within the church and within the world, Satan must be contended with, because he's trying to exert control and power in both. And so that would be how I would, like in a broad sense, approach that imagery. But I'm sure you've got something in mind since you asked the question.
I do. Given the general anti-imperial tone of Revelation compared with the rest of Scripture, it is the most unambiguously anti-imperial text in the entire Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but think that it's not an accident that Pergamon was the location of the imperial seat in Asia Minor before Ephesus was. So my guess is at the time of this writing, that's where the seat of imperial power is, hence the seat of Satan. I think it's that simple. Because the emperor's claim is a direct rival to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
The emperor claims to be both Lord and Son of God.
So it's like the seat of Babylon, sort of.
And I was going to just bring that up. So Bauckham in this book here, Bauckham makes a very interesting point about the imagery of the whore of Babylon, and the way that she is depicted has what he points out as striking parallels to the goddess Roma.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you kind of have these two aspects, the masculine and the feminine aspects of the Roman Empire, right, in the imperial cult that's associated with Satan, that has more to do with the exercise of political power. And then Babylon is more associated with the feminine cultural and economic,
right, which we are the current inheritors of.
Wait, are you talking about America, Nate?
Yes. Who else would I be talking about?
If you
want to, like, seriously, if you really want to know where America is in the book of Revelation, look for the whore and the emperor. We're both at the same time. I mean,
right. And you're not going to get any disagreement from me, but I think that this is something, and this goes back, and Jason, this is something that we Nate and I have talked about quite a bit. Like, both of us, if you knew where I worked, by the way, it would be even funnier, but both of us are quite anti-imperial in our overall outlook, like a kind of a relentless critique of empire. Right.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that is the image of Babylon, and like Satan's throne. If we're going with that imagery, I would think that's just the city, or you could say the United States. Like, kind of like how Mary is the image for the seat of Christ. Like, it's the feminine aspect, like you're talking about, that is the throne, and it's.
I believe it's geographically in between Pergamon and Thyatira, which is the next church address after this, is where you actually had like the Plutonian oracle, where you have this like kind of like nether region looking hellscape, part of the actual geographical landscape within Asia Minor.
There's believed that's right. That's the portal to Tartarus, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And that's like geographically right in between. So there's like, so the landscape reflects what's being said here. So not only do you have it as a seat of imperial power, but it sits in the middle of a landscape that looks like a hell on earth.
Mm-hmm.
So does that tie into what you were saying earlier about the angels as well, where the angels are over a geographical location, but is it not so much a specific geographical location, but like what that the geography reflects? Because like later in Revelation, he says spiritually called Sodom or Egypt and things like that. Like you could, like if Babylon was a specific an angel of Babylon or whatever you want to say. Well, then now this angel's over the United States, and now the United States looks like Babylon.
Well, I think that like what we have to kind of, because Revelation, I think, is dealing with kind of the hegemonic control over the world system, right? So it's using decidedly Roman imagery, but I think it's a relentless critique on earthly power, like
yeah,
one way or the other. I think it's a relentless critique on earthly power, and so I think that one of the things that you'll always find elusive in if you're approaching Revelation of any kind of one-to-one correspondence between the spiritual imagery and the earthly manifestation, I think, is very difficult. It's fraught with a lot of difficulty. Not to say that there are no correspondences, by the way, but just that the one-to-one doesn't always line up. So is America Babylon and Rome? Well, America is like just the most recent iteration of hegemonic control over the world system, which is pretty close to like where things are, and like even where we sit in the West and our relative rivalry with the kings of the East, with China and Russia. Like, yeah, there's some rhyme and reason in even the structure that the book is presenting. But I think that like this is something that Bulgakov is good on. Bach is probably better. And like if you get into like an actual exegetical commentary of the book, I think this comes out in really stark relief, is the anti-imperialism, right? Mm-hmm. And what is really interesting to me is that the overall reception of the book, within the Christian canon has been extraordinarily fraught, because I think that the book is just like, more than anything else, is that trenchant, unrelenting criticism of worldly power through the empire. And that's also something that Christianity basically subsumed. We took on an empire and became one. And to me, like in terms of like the historically speaking, like to read Revelation from a historical perspective, I find that itself is one of the most ironic historical realities of Christianity, is that it became the very empire that it tried to overcome.
So now I think we should talk about the letter to Thyatira, because that is sometimes used as the defense of Christendom.
Okay. I'm just opening up there. So
which I believe Bulgakov explicitly rejects, if I recall reading it. The message. Oh, here, I'll just read. I think I just happened to stumble right into this. This is the section that Bulgakov actually writes about the letter to Thyatira. Mm-hmm. The message written to the angel of the Thyatiran church is about the revelation of him who has appeared in his majesty, the Son of God, who hath eyes like unto flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. He speaks to judge, having authority, and weighing thy works and charity and service and faith and thy patience and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Obviously, this is not about individual achievements and temptations, but about the sum total of the works of the whole life. Particular temptations come here through the false prophet Jezebel, who teaches to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed to idols. We have no information about whereby to decipher the historical symbol or relate it to a specific, to a special place, time, and event. Evidently, what is understood here is the temptation of a hypothetical civilization, which later takes the form of Babylon, extending to a comparatively lengthy age. I gave her time to repent, in which unrepentant repentance provokes the wrath of God. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he that searcheth the reins and hearts. Let's see, blah, blah, blah. Let's see, where's the section? Well, you guys can talk about that while I look for the. Oh, here we go. Here's the part that I was looking for. Okay. The one who overcomes is called to the fidelity that he has already assumed and is promised authority over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers. To this is added, even as I received authority of my Father, attempting to relate this to a concrete historical phenomenon of the Constantinian era, for instance, as is sometimes done, is fruitless. But it obviously relates to some outright confrontation between the Christian and non-Christian worlds, and a palpable manifestation of Christ's power in history. And I will give him the morning star, which is called below 22:16, the root and offspring of David, a theocratic earthly king. This then is a matter of specific vocation to royal ministry with Christ. So that's what I was thinking of. So he's kind of having his cake and eating it too there.
Well,
to be honest with you, that's my reaction.
What's your in what way would you say
he's
that?
like, he's rejecting the idea of tying it to a particular era of Christianity, so he doesn't want to tie it to the imperial church, but he still wants to have it be related to a theocratic kingship on earth.
Well, I think that
endorsed by Christ. So it's like, no, I can see how that was wrong, but but history is still needs to manifest a theocratic kingship endorsed by Christ.
Well, I think that is,
but what,
like, I think that sense, I think that like, I would, to stick up for Bulgakov on that. Like, I do see what you're saying, but I think that what that feeds into is the millennial thinking, like his own sense of the fullness and the arrival of the post-apocalyptic kingdom, right? So beyond what he distinguishes between two horizons, and you'll see that in his little excursus at the end of the book, Jason, in Even So Come. He talks about the two horizons. There's an apocalyptic horizon that leads to the culmination of history as we know it, and then the eschatological horizon that culminates in the New Jerusalem. And so there's that interval, there's that millennial interval. And I want to actually I want to riff on that, because it connects to some of the things we've been talking about. And I'm throwing this out as a thought experiment, and like, I don't have any tentative, this is a very tentative reading, right?
Okay.
But I think that, we've talked about, like, in that Song of the 144,000, the creative vocation of the people of God, that's going to be essential. I think that that's actually entailed within some of the imagery here, right? And some of, like, the ideas of fractal unfolding, right? Well, fractal, like, already within it is fracture, right? There's a breaking that is inherent to the growth and creation process itself. And I'll tie that into stack that with another metaphor, as the metaphor of a seed. Well, a seed falls to the earth and dies, and the way it dies in the germination of a seed is it cracks in half, it fractures, and then the inner contents of
that has a lot of parallelism to the Shekinah story,
right? And so this Davidic function, right? This is a really fascinating thing that is being held out to the corporate ministry of the church, is that those conquerors are given power over the Gentiles or over the nations, and will shepherd them with a rod of iron. They're shattered like clay vessels. And I see, like, if you look at the nations as just kind of this container, right? The whatever the social, political, and cultural arrangements of the nations are, is a kind of container for whatever's in there. So I'm going to just be a little bit creative here and say, let's say that, those clay vessels, those earthen vessels, were used to store things from seed to wine to oil. But typically, let's just say it's containing, like, grain, right? That would be either used for later food use or replanting in agricultural use. Is that breaking is breaking the structure, so that the internal reality can come out and grow into what it actually is, right? So that shattering, and that because I think that there's, like, kind of that dominionist and triumphal type readings of Revelation that I can understand why people go there, but I think that the imagery is actually calling us into a subversive interpretation of the text.
So you're tying this to breaking up of things that are used for storage.
Right. So the nations and the
imperial, which represents some sort of radical opening up, where there's nothing is there. The vessels are broken because God doesn't want anything to be stored or hoarded anymore.
It doesn't want to be contained. The vessel is the problem. Whatever is being contained in there. So saying like, hey, this is grain that is meant to be planted and be productive back into, like, there's an inherent capacity and entelechy within like the people within a nation that are constrained and constricted by these kind of forces that Revelation is specifically critiquing, namely imperial power manifest in kind of that masculine political and the feminine cultural, right? So you get this relentless critique, and that's the structure that's being broken open. And it's not being broken open through violent force, even though the image itself is a violent image. It's actually being undone and broken through the witness of the church by bearing witness to Christ in history. And that those images, they're so stacked within the book of Revelation that it's like easy to lose it when you're not looking at it in that holistic fashion. And so I guess like within Thyatira, like you have that interesting, it's a Davidic promise that's coming right out of Psalm 2, essentially. And what's interesting is, while that, is interpreted primarily within our Christian tradition as a reference to Christ and his messianic ministry, that messianic ministry is then being extended and to the church that is sharing in his anointing and is sharing in that role of breaking open those vessels, those clay vessels, so that what is inside the vessels and is being contained, in a sense, hidden and not productive within the vessels is released.
I think
there's a creative unleashing. I don't know. I mean, does that track?
No, that tracks with me very well, and it also fits really well with a lot of other Bulgakov's writings about his millenarianism, about his view of what the church is, about his ideas about enchurchment, and how he sees the church as primarily having an educative function, so that it's supposed to transform the culture in an educated fashion. And I definitely see a link between the image that you're describing and that kind of role of the church. But what I want to understand here is, how exactly do you think, he doesn't leave much for us on the page here, other than just suggesting some sort of theocratic monarchy endorsed by Christ. So, which John Milbank would be giving a thumbs up, because apparently I love John. He's a great theologian, but his politics are abysmal. But but what do you think he actually envisions here? And how does that tie to his millenarian views? And I mean, how literally is it the reign of, like, because to me, it has to be the reign of Christ. Now, what the reign of Christ could be envisioned as the reign of his church, of his true church. Like, we are the body of Christ. So you could definitely say what's meant by the theocratic kingship of Christ here is the rule of the church, but it has to be the direct authority of Christ. I don't think there could be a person who is singularly endowed with that Christic true monarchic authority.
Which is what the church is ceded to that, right? Within the concept of the Christian emperor, which I think was an understandable and maybe an inevitability, but it was a mistake. It was a critical error.
Yeah, Bulgakov is very clear about that in many places. So I know what he doesn't think it is.
I think it's kind of like his Sobornos or his conciliar view.
Right.
Like, I think that there's a corporate, like, I think that.
So you think it's a corporate kingship?
Yeah.
Where the body of Christ, the body of Christ itself rules directly through the kingship of Christ.
But yes, and the nature of that rule is almost precisely the opposite of the paradigm of Christendom.
Well, it's plenitude. That's why the breaking of the vessels.
Right. In a sense,
because you don't need to hoard things in vessels if you see reality as plenitude, as plenitude. It only is scarcity that leads you to store up things in vessels of clay or whatever we're storing things in today. Right. But was what was used in the time that this was written. So I actually think that actually, I 100% agree with you that what is being talked about being shattered there with the rod of iron, those vessels, I actually do think it has to do with this system of hoarding and storing things in order to gain power over other people. Like that is what's being talked about in that image. I think you're 100% right about that. And I never thought of that before. But as soon as you said it, I'm like, yep, that's exactly right. Yeah. It tracks 100% with the image.
And I think it's just like my sense. I'm so delicate around these issues, but I'll just be kind of straight up. I think that we have to be. It requires a spiritual vision and a wisdom to understand what that exercise of power looks like, right? Because we in overcoming empire, which the church did in a sense, they overcame the empire, but they just became it, right? Which was in a sense, I have no problem historically calling that the fall of the church, right? That's our Edenic moment where we traded the crown of thorns for Caesar's for Caesar's chaplet, right? And so it is not exercised, like the authority is exercised in the same way that Christ exercises authority, which is from the cross, bearing faithful witness, right? We get these violent images, but they're subverted immediately within the book, right? And I think that's where people struggle in the book of Revelation is it's like, well, the imagery is violent and terrifying. And it's like, yeah, it is, but it's the internal logic of it all is actually nonviolent.
I agree.
And the breaking it with the rod of iron, or coming after Jezebel with the sword of his mouth, right? Well, what is that? What is he coming after her with? Is he coming after her with a physical sword? Is he physically killing a woman in Thyatira? No, right? He's making war upon like our concourse and intercourse with the world system that is containing within it something real and good and valuable, but is an inappropriate container. And he is shattering that with the word of his mouth, with the exercise of his I would say his royal ministry, and the royal ministry of the church likewise is one of martyrdom, right? Of bearing faithful witness. And so all of this, the authority of the church is reducible to our witness. And it really doesn't extend much beyond that. And, I see that because I think one of my animating concerns in this kind of apocalyptic age that we live in is the false theocratic impulse for worldly power.
Right.
So anyway, I've
we would both
enough.
agree. Right. No,
I want to hear what Jason has to say. So.
Yeah, let's hear Jason talk about.
No, I mean, I don't know. This is kind of a new thought to me. I was getting hung up a little bit on the iron part for some reason, because I was just thinking, well, you could have said any metal here. What's the significance of that? It seems like it conveys a like very harsh imagery, like because I don't know, when you think of iron, you just think of like just something heavy and metal and just crushing power. But what you said actually made me think of in Jeremiah when he's pronouncing judgment over Moab. Is that how you say that? You guys might be familiar with that, where it says that what does it say? Moab has been at ease from his youth. He has settled on his dregs. He has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into captivity. Therefore his taste remained in him, and his scent has not changed. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will send wine workers who will tip him over and empty his vessels and break his bottles. So I don't know. That's just what came to mind when you were talking about the shattering of the vessels and.
Well, in the original, that original image of the rod of iron, right, is really it's emerging out of like Bronze Age kingship. Iron was actually a precious commodity at the time, not because it wasn't plentiful, but because most people didn't have the technology to smelt iron into, and that comes out in like the conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites, right? The Philistines had iron, the Israelites didn't.
Yeah.
And so it's actually, in its original context, is a precious metal, right? So a iron scepter was a signification of wealth technological mastery and of rule.
Okay.
Right. So
yeah.
it's a really powerful image in its kind of its original context. By the time you get into the Iron Age and everything's made of iron, it maybe loses some of that initial force that you would get maybe in the Hebrew Bible, because it's like everybody's got iron by the time you're, Rome is built with iron, right?
Yeah. And it's there's just a lot of imagery that's embedded in iron. I think that's why I was kind of getting stuck there too, because even like, it's in your blood, everything like that.
Oh, it's definitely a symbol of,
it's
it's definitely a symbol of power, but the thing you have to keep in mind is that we still have to, what Jed is pointing at is that we still have to read this through the lens of the revelation of power that we have in Christ, and that power is revealed to be almost the antithesis of what power is from the eyes of the world. Let me just, this is actually probably a little bit of a spoiler to our next Meditations on Material conversation on letter 11 that should be happening on Saturday, but I just wanted to share this. This is from letter 11 on force. The deeper meaning, mystical, gnostical, magical, and hermetic, of overcoming is to change the enemy into a friend. So notice the overcoming language that happens in this. So this is why I'm bringing this up. Yeah, because it happens throughout these addresses. He who overcomes, he who overcomes. So the deeper meaning of overcoming is to change the enemy into a friend. To render him impotent is not yet victory. Thus, the Germany of 1914 was certainly rendered impotent in 1918, but was not overcome, as the year 1939 proves. But after the defeat of 1945, Germany was certainly overcome, insofar as she is sincerely allied to her old adversaries. The same applies to Japan as a state. On another plane, it is likewise true that the devil will be overcome only at that moment when his voice, no matter whether it is rough or smooth, will be heard in a chorus with the choirs of celestial hierarchies praising God. That's from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, letter 11. And just like goes right to the heart of what we're.
Yeah. So I mean, God overcomes his enemies. We get language of destruction, and I think that the destruction is real. What is being destroyed is the enmity.
Yeah.
Right. The principle of the principle of enmity.
Because that's another meaning of the vessels, right? Because the vessels aren't the vessels aren't really ultimately what's real. The vessels are artifice, but by their nature, they're things that are made by the hands of man. They're not really part of the creation.
Right. And so and I think that that's like a really fruitful line of thinking, that it really connects to like Bulgakov's, like, I mean, his incredible insistence on the final restoration of Satan in this book specifically, which
Tomberg reiterates,
right?
In the passage I just read,
his statements are about as strong as some of the strongest statements on universalism I've ever read come from Bulgakov's essay in this book, right? Like, essentially, to concede that there is any kind of final force to Satan's rebellion is ultimately to concede to diabolism within creation as a dominant principle, and Bulgakov won't have that. And so, like, the breaking and the violent images that we get in the Book of Revelation are like, in a sense, the divine assault on that enmity principle that overcomes it. But like, in the same way that, we who are far off, or at one point were God's enemies, have ceased to be his enemies, that enmity is being overcome, not through him destroying us, but by him making us into a different vessel, a friendship that is forged, that is forged really, like, if you're thinking in Romans, like the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. So beneath all the disturbing visuals that the imagery evokes is, I think, the more I read through Revelation, the more I see the hidden kindness of the book, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's like an unrelenting kindness that's overcoming, and it's a military or a martial kindness,
right? Because everything that is false or impure will be destroyed,
right?
That remains
Mhm.
true.
Yeah, and so there's that, like, you don't have to shy away from the imagery in the book, but you have to interpret this thing not through kind of like the crude dispensational lens of kind of sitting back at the end of the world and sharing the destruction and the actual destruction of real persons, and these kinds of things, that who's on the winning side and who's on the losing side. Well, the overcomers are the ones who are actually drawing the world into its victory, into itself, like what Bulgakov really gets into a lot in The Bride of the Lamb, but also in his sections where he expounds the millennium more in the book, is like this nuptial bliss between Christ and the church that is conciliar. And it's not entirely clear in Bulgakov's millennium if Christ is physically reigning on earth or not, or if he's reigning through the saints, or in what direct relationship the saints have in that millennial kingdom.
Okay.
But it's interesting to me.
Let me ask if the intent is if we want to be hyper literalist and we want to envision the parousia as like a literal coming of Jesus riding on the clouds, and we want to interpret the millennial reign of Christ of being like Jesus, like in the flesh, directly ruling in the millennium, then what is the purpose of the ascension in the first place? Which is, by the way, what Jews ask a lot. Like, they don't get what was the purpose of the ascension?
I hope this is a rhetorical question. I don't know.
So I'm going to play with you a little bit on this, Nate.
Okay, go for it.
Like, when kind of faced with the question of is the parousia, is the second coming, is it symbolic or is it literal? And my answer to that question is yes.
Yes, exactly. No, mine too.
And so I what shape it takes, I could speculate, but I don't have a problem with the idea of and I think that some of the, like, let's just put it this way, the eschatological expectations in the Hebrew scriptures lend itself to some kind of terrestrial reign, messianic terrestrial reign, right? I do think that. And I think that, losing the Jewish character and the Israelite character of the scriptures, and kind of the centrality of the land and the restoration of the land. Now I think that applies beyond the borders of the Holy Land itself. But so I think that whatever it looks like, it will bear the marks of both, but in what way, I can't say. You know what I mean?
Well, I think the biggest clue we have is, like, if you look at the parable of the sheep and the goats, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is...
That's good.
I mean, think about that. Like, people are told that they were encountering Christ and they didn't know it. We're told that we are the body of Christ. We know the we have a feast of the ascension. Like, right? We know that, like, that in the incarnation, like, divine nature and human nature commingled. Mm-hmm. So I think, to me, the answer is obvious, but for some reason we just want to evade it because it makes us squeamish, because it means that the bar is really high.
Yeah, so I was just reading, like, there's this, it connects to something. So do you follow Chris Green at all? Like on Twitter?
No, I don't.
Chris is an interesting guy. I don't have any personal interactions with him, but he put up this tweet this morning or yesterday that connects exactly to that. So he's quoting John of Damascus. Now there are many Christs and Jesuses, but only one crucified.
Right.
Therefore, the sign of Christ is to be adored, for wherever the sign may be, there too he will be. Right. And I think it's like John of Damascus is, I don't know, I don't know the context in which that quote is emerging, because I've never read that particular quote before. But I think there is that sense where Christ's presence, whether you want to convey that in terms of his literal physical return on earth or something symbolic, is always manifest in and among his people as Christs, as
Right.
little Christs, as ones who are anointed and co-heirs with him, that have been co-seated with him, like Paul will talk about in Ephesians. Like whatever the character is, and however symbolic or literal we want to get in questions of millennium, questions of second coming. And I kind of leave that. I think Bulgakov does a good job of leaving it kind of a lot of openness to fulfillment without saying, "Hey, this is exactly what it's going to be." 'Cause who of us knows?
If the story of the new creation mirrors the story of the creation, as I think we'd have every reason to think it ought, what you have is, out of the multi-unity that is God, you have from that essential starting multi-unity, you have an explosion into more expressions of that multiplicity.
And I think like the kind of like in that evolution of consciousness, and where this connects to some of that discussion that we had not too long ago, the three of us.
Right.
I think that there is like as we get into like that final participation, and as we approach that, and I think that like we're in one of those strange epochs in history where that veil is lifting, right? Between the sensible and the super sensible world. You can track that. I mean, I would say that the ufology field is all about that, in a sense.
Yeah, it's just, yes, in its strange, within its very limited modernist kind of vernacular, yes. But
yeah, of course.
The irony about that whole thing is that it's about more than it thinks it is.
It's about re-mythologizing. It's about re-enchantment.
That's exactly right.
It's a re-enchantment of the cosmos, which is ironically being forced upon us in kind of in the very like the cold hard language of science.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that like what we're looking at, and in the constellation of images that Revelation presents to us, is a period of history in which God's presence is more palpably manifest on earth. Right. There's a hiddenness to his presence on earth, and a hiddenness within his presence within the church that awaits further revelation, that awaits a further apocalypse. And I think that that's what, when we're in these kind of apocalyptic cycles, which I think that we are in the present moment as well, is that what we can await to is an unfolding and an unveiling of the depth and the meaning and I think in a very practical way, like the practical outworkings of what the presence of God on earth is and how God is present. And I think that the imagery in Revelation is speaking of a corporate, speaking in those bridal terminology, like, the Christ's final union with his bride. We're progressing the further we progress historically, the more we progress into the fullness of that revelation. It's just, if you were to look take a glance at, kind of the scene that is happening and unfolding in the world today, if you're looking with just your natural eyes, it's a mess. It's a total mess. Right. But underneath that is there's a deeper story within the story that's being told that awaits its day in the sun.
Well, that's for Bach, like in terms of what you were just talking about, like when Christ returns, it's not simply the return of Christ, but it's actually the return. It is actually the entire supersensible world that just becomes undeniably present. So, which is what the entire idea of the marriage of heaven and earth is about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as long as we think that these things are divided, as long as we were with that duality, then we won't be able to see it. But it's coming. I think it's coming no matter what. The time is coming when no one will be able to deny that
the
those
super
things
sensible
exist
is like exerting
alongside
like
each other.
yeah, the super sensible is and in God's kingdom is exerting its inexorable force upon the world.
Yep.
And like ultimately, like there's at some point there is that convergence that comes in the parousia, right? In the second coming.
Yeah.
And you know, and the images that the scriptures give us in the second coming just are themselves like hidden images. Like
Right.
we don't
And
necessarily know exactly what that's going to mean.
when you and there's a way in which to see Christ face to face really must mean to see the Christ in everyone.
Absolutely. It can't be anything less than that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's why I like that you brought up that Matthew passage.
Yep.
I think that's the
I think it's a
template
big key
for ruling like in not an empire way, is to the things that lays out there to serve Christ in all those little ways.
Well, in that Christian, the Christian vocation is to summon through our royal ministry, which is one of love, is to summon forth Christ from others.
Yeah.
To you know, is in recognizing, is to call him out.
But they have to see it. They have to see it in order to be able to respond to it. So you have to be able to demonstrate it.
The revelation itself is like the image, like in the church of Thyatira, it's that breaking. And what is it what is the mechanism? What is that rod of iron? The exercise of rule is actually, it's bound up in the witness of the church that problematizes the world itself and says, no, this is not actually the world. Not yet.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the
which connects right back to going back to the letter to Ephesus, that first love. That's why we have to, that's why that's important.
Yeah.
Because the first love, that childlike wonder in the creation, like the child is not experiencing the world that's divided between the super sensible and the sensible. That is not how a child experiences it.
Well, and I think that you get those kind of this dual, like, for God so loved the world, like he loves the cosmos as it truly is, right? But we're also called to not love the world and not love the way it appears to us, the way it presents itself to us is actually a false world, is an unworld, right?
It's and so the closed circle world of the serpent.
Breaking that open
talks about,
right? It's the
that's
breaking
exactly
open.
Right, a breaking open of that's yes, precisely.
And I think that's where circle. I think that's where, like, I would say that's very much in keeping with Bulgakov and his overall theological program and his overall the thrust and the message within the book, within this book.
I'm definitely looking forward to the next chapter.
I do. Yeah, the next chapter is a doozy, man.
I'm really looking forward to it, because this, to me, like this is when we went through M.L. Bach's Apocalypse of John, the way he interpreted Revelation 4 and 5, which we're going to come up on in Bulgakov's book, was just earth-shattering to me. It was so obvious once I saw it, but I don't know how I didn't manage to see it before. And it really changed the entire way I read the book of Revelation and the Bible entirely. So I'm really looking forward. I've kind of looked at a little bit what Bulgakov says, and I know it's going to align. So I'm very excited about talking about that for our next installment.
This next installment is going to be a really fun one, because it's one of my favorite chapters in all of the whole book. Like chapters 4 and 5, both in terms of it gives you the whole framework of, like, John's viewing Earth from heaven, from the perspective of heaven.
Yeah, see, that's what Bach says too.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to have that's the controlling setting of the book. The whole book is
for M.L. Bach. What happens in Revelation 4 and 5 is actually essentially it's the heavenly view of what's happening in the Genesis story, whereas Genesis gives you, so that's which ties the beginning and the end of the Bible. So let's just and Bulgakov seems to be very aligned with that interpretation. So I'm looking forward to get into that in our next week.
Cool.
So thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
I'll get this
Yeah.
posted sometime soon. I'll send you a link when I got it up. And
Appreciate
I'll make sure you guys get a link so you can post it on your channels too.
All right.
Thank you both.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Yep.
You guys
Sounds
have a good
great.
night.